What's up everybody, it's Joe with J Blake Photo, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to take some of your great images out of Lightroom and pushing them into HDR and then getting them into an HDR timeline in Final Cut Pro. Real quick before we jump into the video, I'm Joe, this is my channel. If you haven't watched any of my videos before, I am coming back to YouTube after having basically a year off. My channel got demonetized, my site went away, my Facebook and Instagram accounts got hacked and then deleted. But I'm back now and I am trying to get back into the swing of things. So I'd really appreciate you hitting that subscribe button and the like button to tell the algorithm that I'm doing a good job. Today's video, we're going to be going over those HDR features in Lightroom, which aren't brand new, but I have been just banging my head against the wall to try to get these photos in all their glory into Final Cut Pro. Now, if you're like me and you like to show your work off on YouTube, especially your photography and your videography, you know that you've been able to film in 10-bit log or 10-bit raw on lots of different cameras. I personally shoot with the Canon mirrorless series like the R and the R6, as well as drones from DJI like the Mavic 2 Pro that allow you to shoot in log profiles that then when imported into things like Final Cut or Premiere, you can then really kind of color correct those videos to really burst in those higher highlights and darker darks, and to give your viewer, if they're on an HDR display, a phenomenal view of your work. And for a very long time, that has only worked with video, and stills have really been kind of like pulling teeth. So what I have been trying to do, what I've been trying to do for a while now, and what hasn't been working until very recently, is the ability to export a file that's been edited for HDR in Lightroom Classic, and then import it into Final Cut Pro and have all of those adjustments come with, without having to really kind of boost the image with a lot of adjustments and color correction in Final Cut, other than what you might normally do for it to match your scene. So we're going to jump into Lightroom Classic. We're going to take a look at a photo. We're going to tweak it up into the HDR space. It's already been edited, but we're going to now push it into HDR. And then we're going to import it into Final Cut Pro, throw it on the timeline, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. It's hard to do those kinds of edits without an HDR screen because you really want to see how it looks, but I'll show you on the scopes kind of how to adjust for that. Okay, let's jump in. So right now we are looking at a photo that I took out at Grant Lake, out in the Mammoth Lakes area, out in Northern California. This was about 2 years ago. And this is a beautiful image. It's already been edited a bit in Lightroom and Photoshop, so I'm relatively happy with the overall look, and I don't plan on making a lot of changes. But obviously, as you can see up here in our histogram, we're not doing anything in the HDR. We're not doing anything in the kind of HDR space. So we're going to switch over to the Development tab, and we're going to see that HDR button that is in Lightroom now pop up. And we're going to go ahead and hit that, and you'll see that now we have this whole other area of our image for HDR. We're being given a warning here. Let's take a look and see what that is. Oh, so it's giving me an error because I'm currently on an SDR display. I actually have two displays here. I have my big monitor that I do a lot of my editing on, that is SDR, and then I have my HDR display, which is my XDR monitor on my MacBook Pro. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to boost the overall exposure here, and I am going to increase the contrast just a bit. But as I'm looking at this, really this looks very blown out. This is very difficult to see, and so I'm going to move this window over into my HDR display so that you can kind of see this a little bit better. Okay, so now I can see on my other display here, which you also can see, which is a little bit smaller. So I'm going to hide away some of these toolbars because I don't need them. But now I can see these highlighted areas are really starting to pop, but I want to bring them up just a little bit more. So I'm going to really kind of bring them up here and probably bring my exposure down just a bit. whites up just a little bit. So the area that I'm really focusing on is here. Like I really want this to pop as much as possible in the final image. As well as some of the kind of, as the sun is coming up over this ridge, you can really kind of see that that's really starting to get bright. So I like that. That actually looks really nice. It's not overdone. Also kind of in these reflections on the water, these are really starting to really kind of pop visually for me as I'm looking at it on my HDR screen. So now I've got this photo how I want it, and you can see I'm utilizing quite a bit of the HDR space here. It looks good for me, and I'm sure that if I were to look at this on my iPhone, it would look phenomenal, or any other HDR display. So I'm going to export this onto my desktop, and as I scroll down here, I'm going to take a look at my file settings. And there's a couple of different options. You've got JPEG, JPEG XL, AVIF, PSD, TIFF, PNG, DNG, and original. And a couple of these, when you select them, they'll actually give you the option to do an SDR output and to select the color space. Now, while the P3 color space is probably even more, I would say, expansive than what we would call Rec 2020, which is traditionally what you would see in a HDR kind of color space, Final Cut doesn't like it. So if we move down into JPEG XL, you can see now that we have 709, which is standard SDR. We have P3, and we now have 2020. I'm gonna cut to the chase here and say that I've tried all of these, and the only one that seems to work is the AVIF file when you select HDR Rec 2020. The other really important thing here is to make sure that you have the HDR output selected. Even though you have the HDR output selectable here, even under HDR sRGB Rec 709, if you output it to Rec 709, I don't really know how that's gonna, like, that's the wrong color space. Maybe it'll give you the light information, I don't know. But what I can tell you is that this works. So we're gonna go ahead and export this as HDR Rec 2020, AVIF as the image format, which I'd never heard of until playing with this. And now I'm gonna go ahead and hit export. Okay, so now I've got that image exported, and now what I wanna do is I wanna now pull it up in Final Cut, right? So before you can add HDR content to your project or your timeline, you have to make sure first that your library is set up for wide gamut color. And to do that, you're going to select it here and go over into your info pane. And if you click on modify, you'll actually be able to see that you can select standard gamut or wide gamut HDR. I think once you start using the library, if you've already set it standard, you can't change it to wide and vice versa. So I'm going to keep this at wide. And if I go down into my event and I select my, my project, you'll see up here as well in the info tab, I can change which color space it has if I go to modify. You can also change the resolution of the project, the frame rate of the project, right? This is your standard project settings, as well as your rendering codec. But down here under color space, this is where you select whether or not it's going to be wide gamut or not. If you have it in standard Rec 709 and you try to add a piece of content to it that is not HDR, it'll work fine. If you add content that is HDR, it'll tone map it to Rec 709. If you want to continue in a complete HDR workflow, you need to make sure that you are selecting this Rec 2020 option, or Rec 2020 PQ, or Rec 2020 HLG, which kind of depends on what your workflow is and where you're outputting. So now let's go get our HDR content. Now I've actually selected two, and now in the library view here, it is being tone mapped, but in the viewport here, I can actually see that it is in fact HDR. So I don't actually need to do anything to it. I can just drop it onto the timeline, and there are my two clips, and they are HDR. Now, if I wasn't running an HDR monitor and I couldn't check this for sure, one other thing that I could do is bring up my scopes. Now, bringing up my scopes, you'll notice over here I've got RGB overlay, and it's telling me that I'm working in Rec 2020 with this particular timeline. And as I mouse over the different clips, I can see that my RGB overlay is telling me that these images are in fact reaching luminance levels over 1000. Whereas with a Rec 2020, you're normally maxing out at between 100 and 120 lumens. Whereas in this case, we can go all the way up to 10,000, but most displays are going to be between 600 and 1,000. So just know that you're shooting for that. I know that the XDR display, at least the one on my MacBook, I think has peak 1600 nits. So I know that it will be able to push a little bit further than that, which is why things don't look blown out even when they're pushed that high. For example, in this one, I'm not really seeing any blowouts, even though according to this, some of these areas are pushing over to 2000 nits. Now you can go into your traditional exposure controls and kind of bring some of that down if you want to, just to make sure that you're not going to blow out the monitors of your viewers. And you can do that however you prefer, whether you want to use the traditional color board or any of the other features that are in Final Cut. But there you go. And now when you export this as footage, right, let's throw in a cross dissolve transition. I'm not using any adjustments. I don't have to use the HDR tools or anything like that. It's just HDR. And so if I export this, I can do this a couple different ways. If I go into settings, you'll notice there's a warning down here because the default codec to encode is going to be H.264, and you want to use HEVC 10-bit so that you actually get you can actually encode the full quality. And now I'm going to go ahead and export this photo. And one thing to know, and obviously this is only 8 seconds of HDR content, but one thing to know is that it will take considerably longer to export HDR content than it will regular content. It's a lot bigger. It'll take a lot more horsepower. I have an M1 Max with 24 cores, and I think I want to say 30 GPU cores. I don't even remember, but it does have the media encoder, so it goes pretty quick with stuff like this for me. But these files are pretty big. They also take longer for social platforms like YouTube to crunch once you upload them. And you'll have to play with kind of best settings. Maybe I'll talk about that in another video. But for those of you who have desperately wanted to take HDR, high quality photos out of Lightroom, now that Lightroom can do full HDR, and export them to your Final Cut timelines, that's how you do it. If you have any questions, go ahead and throw them down in the comments. I'd be happy to get into some back and forth on some of your techniques and some of the things that you're doing. This is something that I have wanted to do for a very long time, and suddenly it just seems to work. So I wanted to show everybody how it works. Anyway, thanks for watching. Go ahead and hit like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks.